In this video, I'm going to be looking at what I consider to be the 3 biggest consistency killers with your irons. We're going to start by looking at the golf swing from the face on. Now, strike is everything. If you can strike the ball well, there's a good chance you're going to get a predictable outcome and you're going to be more consistent. When we're looking at strike, we have to land the club in the same place relative to the ball. It always has to be landing on the ground about where the ball is, and then, depending on the club you're using, working downwards into the ground and having that negative angle of attack. So let's say I take this, really nice setup. I've got a 7-iron in my hands, and I've addressed the ball really nice. I've created some good relationships. My strike is always going to be less consistent if through that golf swing I'm making any lateral movements with my upper body or my lower body, at that matter. Because if my head moves off to the right, the circle that I effectively swing the club on is also going to move in that direction. Therefore, I'm likely to hit the ground before the ball, or if I miss the ground, I'm likely to thin or top the golf ball. In most cases, those golfers who do have a lateral sway off the ball will have an attempt to return to where they were. Yes, it might work the odd time, but it's not going to be consistent. And if you're that golfer who knows that you can hit some good shots and you wonder why it's not happening more often, it can very often be because you've got a lateral sway in there. So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to give you some simple ideas. I'm not going to really touch on any drills, but some things that you can do on the golf course straight away to give you some instant improvement. The first thing I want you to do is imagine, well, I call this the wall concept. So if I was to take, I'm going to put my golf club down to a side here. I'm going to take my setup to this golf ball. I want you to imagine that I'm stood with a wall to my trail side, and my trail shoulder is touching that wall. So because it's touching that wall, I physically wouldn't be able to kind of make this movement. I wouldn't be able to break through that wall. Watch what happens to my shoulder as I make a good rotation. This trail shoulder actually moves pretty quickly away from that wall. So I would start in contact with the wall, and almost straight away I would remove that shoulder from the wall. Now, we look at the golfers who struggle. We don't see that. So often, because the club is moving in this direction, they will often follow it with the upper body. They'll often make this movement, and the lateral sway that we see is very often early in the golf swing. That wall sort of concept or idea can really give you some good ideas on what you're trying to do. So the first little exercise I'll have you do is, take a setup to a ball or just inside, and just imagine that you're making a backswing with your sole focus of moving that trail shoulder off the wall almost as quick as you can. Now, when you do this as a rehearsal, it's probably going to feel as if you're not moving any weight to that trail side. That's fine. It's a rehearsal. We're at slow speed. We're not making a dynamic movement. Therefore, we're not going to get that dynamic weight shift that we would if we were actually swinging the club at full speed. So the first little exercise, the first little concept is take your trail shoulder off the wall pretty quickly into your backswing. The other one that I want you to think about is if I had a camera directly above you, looking down, what would this shoulder do? This is my trail shoulder here. Well, it wouldn't go this way, as we said, it wouldn't go through that wall, but it would actually move behind me and slightly towards the target. So the more my shoulders rotated, my trail shoulder would end up directly behind my head. So again, when I'm setting over the ball, what do I want to think about? Well, the last thing I want to do is be focusing on the club head and moving it in this fashion, because I get that sway. What I'm actually trying to do is I'm trying to think about my trail shoulder, and I'm trying to move it directly behind my head. What happens to my lead shoulder? Well, my lead shoulder makes the opposite movement. It moves down towards the ball and in front of my head. So if I put the club across my shoulders, you're going to see that movement very clearly. That club head just moves behind me and it disappears from that camera's view. So if you can do that, you're going to have a lot more of a centered turn, and I would guess that you're going to be a lot more consistent. Now, I'm not going to be going at that flag because you can see just how much it's tucked away. So I'm going to go a little left of it, but I'm going to really have those visuals, those concepts in my mind as I make this golf swing. So the second thing that can really hurt your consistency is club path. So club path is the direction that the club head is traveling at impact. If I was hitting a ball straight down to the camera that you're viewing this from, I would want at the point of contact my club to be traveling at the camera or about at the camera. A few degrees left or right isn't going to be too detrimental. The golfers with the most inconsistent results very often have the club working across the golf ball. This would be very much an out to in path. Now, the reason this gives us issues is because number one, it can really affect the strike because we start to lead with the heel. If we miss the heel, we can easily get a ball off the toe. So we start to find strike moves heel and toe across the club face. Number two, it doesn't really transfer the right amount of energy into the ball, so we struggle with distance. And depending on the loft that's in your hand, pitching wedge, 7-iron driver, you're going to get a different amount of curve. We know that the driver with lower loft curves more than a pitching wedge. So you can actually make the same golf swing pretty much with a pitching wedge, a 7 and a driver and get 3 completely different results. Therefore, as you can imagine, it's going to be quite hard to play the game. The more that we can get this neutral path or work towards that, generally the more consistent you're going to be. It's almost pretty obvious, isn't it? If we stood here and said, I wanted to hit a shot towards that green, where should the club be traveling as it hits it? We'd sort of all agree that the club should be traveling about towards the green. But very often we see, say, this across movement, which leads to some inconsistencies. So let's tap into your natural ability, your natural instincts, and use the weight of the golf club, and in this case, the weight of 2 golf clubs. So I've spoken about this, quite a bit in other videos, really using the natural forces that are already within the club and your body. If I was to take 2 golf clubs and hold them together, obviously I can't take my normal grip, but I can kind of take something which is fairly close and just set it to a golf ball and obviously hover them above it. Into posture, and then just started with the club, maybe a foot to 2 feet in front of the ball. I'm really going to relax my arms. I'm going to feel and sense the weight of the club, which is right down at the club head end. And I'm just going to start and put a little bit of movement and momentum into this golf club. And what you'll start to notice is that the golf clubs that I'm swinging match the alignment sticks that are on the floor. Now, when I'm doing this little exercise, it's pretty important that I don't stop. I want this to be sort of one continuous movement back and through. And I'm really starting to pay attention to the weight of the club and let it swing around my body as naturally as I can. When I do that, I wasn't thinking of club path. I was being aware of the weight of the club and I was setting it in motion and allowing my body to support that movement. But what I would have been achieving is a pretty neutral path around that impact. It really wouldn't feel comfortable or make a lot of sense to try and do this because that feels like there's a lot more effort. The golf club from here doesn't want to go out that way. And it's harder to do that with 2 clubs. It wouldn't make a lot of sense to take the club up this way and pull it across because again, it feels very cramped in here. So just starting with 2 clubs, hovering above a golf ball, starting in front of it and just starting the motion and supporting that with what the body's doing. Notice there's a little pivot in my body. And I'm starting to see my club shafts match the ones that are on the ground. This is how I'd love you to start this process. Really getting a sense and a feel of what a pretty neutral path would be like. What we can then do is go back to 1 club, but we can effectively do the same sort of motion. I'm going to start in front and I'm just going to feel like I match the golf club, match the golf club, match the club, match the club. And again, I'm just starting to create this little movement where I'm giving myself a very, very neutral path. The key thing here is that the path that we measure is an impact, but I don't want you to be focused on the ball and what's happening at the ball because it's all to do with the movement that we generate, both sides. If I'm in the poor position here, it's always going to be a cross. Whereas if I'm in a good position here, it's always going to be pretty good. So rather than thinking about the ball and what the club is doing at impact, let's think about the movement itself and let's make sure we're getting this side correct, this side correct. Now, what I could do once I've done a couple of those is I could very simply just let the ball get in the way of my golf club. Now, that wasn't the best strike in the world, but it's starting to build up towards a full swing. The stage after that would be to give yourself some feedback. So for that, I'm going to use a golf ball. I'm going to use a couple of head covers, and I'd encourage you to take, possibly a little bit more time to set this up than what I'm going to do, but I'm going to place these head covers in such a position where I'm creating this little channel into the golf ball. And very simply, if I can make a golf swing with a pretty neutral club path, those head covers will stay in place. If either of those gets knocked or removed or struck, that gives me some pretty good information that my path wasn't quite right. And out to in path would hit that one, into out path, which is kind of tends to be where I live, would hit the inside one. So now I'm worrying about weight of the club, swinging around my body. There's a greenkeeper out there, so let's hit this at much slower speed. So this is the 5-ball drill. I love this. I would say almost every student I work with, I get them to do this during practice. I think it's brilliant. I'm on this par 3 here. Strike is key. You know, if I'm not striking the ball as I want to, I'm always going to be short. And often when you're short, there's trouble. So here I've got bunkers, I've got slope. Strike is key. Now, very often when you're playing golf on the golf course and you're not seeing the consistency that you want, your swing can actually be relatively consistent, but the conditions that you're playing aren't. You know, the ground might be uneven, it might be an upslope, a downslope, the ball might be sitting in a slight depression, it might be in the rough and it might be sitting quite high, you might tee it up on a par 3. There's always a slight change in the scenario or the situation you're in, and that is what can often throw you out and give you those inconsistent results. This is the 5-ball drill. I'm going to basically take my setup to this middle golf ball here, as I would normally. Now, I'm obviously going to have to move some balls out the way, but I'm going to take this setup and I'm basically going to try and hit all of those golf balls from this setup. So I've got to try and hit that golf ball, I've got to try and hit this golf ball, I've got to try and hit the golf ball which is back, and I've got to hit the ball which is forward. Why is that going to help me? You're probably looking at it thinking, what on earth are you doing, Chris? Well, what are we trying to do when we strike the ball? Are we trying to get the golf club to land in the same place on the ground relative to you? No, we're not. That's sometimes a mistake that people make. We're trying to get the club to land in the same place every time relative to the ball. Think about the clubs in your bag. Your wedges get played from the middle of your stance. The long irons get played further up in your stance. You know, if the ground is slightly uneven and the ball is above your feet, the club's got to land, again, somewhere else, but it's got to be in the same place relative to the ball. This is training that. It's developing your skill. If you develop your skill with this little exercise, when you're out on the golf course and you're faced with slopes, depressions, ball sitting up, all of those types of things, you're just going to deal with them because you've developed the ability to control where the club is relative to the ball. Now, this is not easy. I wouldn't expect all these balls to be on the green. In fact, 1 or 2 on the green would be really good. And I'm not going to hit that middle ball in this video because that's my standard ball position, but let's just move that one out of the way. So the first thing I'm going to do, set myself up to where that ball would be, and I'm going to try and make a golf swing and strike this inside ball. Clearly it's going to be a little strange, it's going to be a little awkward. I'm going to move that ball out the way and that ball out the way. Let's just see how we get on. All I'm really looking at here is strike. Can I deliver that club to the ball and get a decent strike? Not bad, little left, but the strike was good. So I actually got a pretty good result from what was a pretty awful setup. Very often, those are the situations on the course where you get a terrible result because you don't react to the situation well enough. The result is often very poor. So let's go for the opposite one now, the one which is further away. So my setup was here. I've now got to make this golf swing and sort of reach out to that golf ball which is further away from me. Oh, that was a lot more difficult and a little bit off the bottom. But that's exactly why we're doing this little exercise. Right, let me just do one more because I'm sure you don't need to see me hit all 5. That would be my normal ball position. Let's move the ball a little further forward and see how we get on. Actually, that was a pretty good strike as well, but it's drifting a little bit right. It's challenging, don't get me wrong, it's difficult, it's not easy, you're not looking for great results, you are looking in practice to challenge yourself, put yourself out your comfort zone. That's where you start to grow, that's where you start to learn, and it's those skills which are going to help you out on the golf course. So to be more consistent with your irons, develop strike, develop your skill when it comes to strike, get your club path pretty neutral, and make sure you're not swaying off the ball too much. If you do those things, I'd almost guarantee you're going to see a higher level of consistency when you play.